as I said, I will begin and I will talk about the Christian right. And I will start with a very brief overview of how the influence of the Christian right evolved and changed over the years. And I should start by saying that neither this influence is new, as we often think that it's mainly, I don't know, with the Trump presidency or earlier with the Bush presidency. It actually dates back to the Jimmy Carter administration, who was the first evangelical and president, and the first one who was so outspoken about his faith and his religious beliefs. And the second point is that another misunderstanding that the influence of the Christian right is not limited to the Republican Party, but on the contrary, the Democratic Party has been also, if not promoting, but at least sustaining this influence. And first of all, as we know, Jimmy Carter was from the Democratic Party, so this influence started from the Democratic Party. And Jimmy Carter was elected with the support of the evangelicals, and it was the time that in the 70s that evangelicals in the United States remobilized after many decades being on the sidelines in order to counter first the legalization of abortion. A few years earlier, that the Supreme Court banned the morning prayer in public schools. So there was this remobilization, mostly manifested by the moral majority movement under Jerry Falwell. And while Jimmy Carter was elected with the support of the evangelicals, he failed to be re-elected exactly because the evangelicals were disappointed by his policies. And among other things, it was also their disappointment in terms of his policy toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I will come back to that later. And they moved their support to Ronald Reagan, and he was the one who actually opened the political space for the evangelicals to get a more pronounced political influence. And after, I won't get into much detail, we don't have much time. And after Reagan and George Bush, Sr., although he was at first a little bit skeptical towards evangelicals, but when Pat Robertson, who is a very prominent member of the Christian right in the United States, said that he would also be a candidate for the Republican Party, in effect, Bush, and so to speak, he had to bend the knee to the evangelicals. And one interesting fact is that he used his son, Bush Jr., to solidify these relations. And then during the Clinton administration, again, as I said earlier, there is misunderstanding that during the Democratic presidents, evangelicals didn't have that much influence. But in reality, the first signs of institutionalization of evangelical influence took place during the Clinton administration, and that was mainly the International Freedom Act that was voted in 1998. And then after Clinton, Bush, again, I don't have to say much. We know how Bush framed much of his policy, and especially in the Middle East, using references to his personal faith. You can actually see here, I think, a very indicative quote from Bush demonstrating exactly the influence of his personal faith. And also you might remember how at first the war against terrorism was framed as a crusade, and then, you know, they tried to, you know, to reframe it, but that was the main, you know, initial, at least, framing of what the policy of the US policy in the Middle East. And also, Bush was the one who allowed evangelicals to take very important key positions within the administration, and starting from very low levels, like interns in the White House, and up to the very higher levels of policy. And after Bush, Obama, like much of his policy towards the Middle East, just continued this, the policy of his predecessor of Bush, and didn't change much. And then with Trump, we could say that Trump was more outspoken about this alliance, and he was the one who solidified. If we look at the electoral data, he was the one who solidified the support of the evangelicals towards the Republican Party. And then finally, Biden, who is a Catholic, so he's not a very good candidate for the evangelicals. He, against Christ, tried to attract some evangelical votes, not those that are the more conservative, but in general, like Obama, after Bush, he more or less continues the policy of Trump. And now, if we look into how what the Christian right wants to achieve through its involvement in foreign policy, and what means it uses to do that. First of all, it, on a more general perspective, it tries to promote conservative Christian values to different international organizations, different for example, it's a lesser known fact that there are a lot of Christian right groups and pressure groups, but even individuals who are involved in UN, different bodies within UN, and try to influence policies. And when I say policy, I mean women's rights, LGBT rights, and et cetera, and also, and now we come to the Middle East. They want to, most of the policies and much of the pressure they put on the interest that they have in foreign policy is to improve what they call the access to converts in the 1040 window. And what is the 1040 window? It is a region that is from the 10th to the 40th parallel north of the equator. And that covers North Africa, much of the sub-Saharan Africa, and all of the Middle East. And it's considered the area that they should focus their missionary work. So they direct much of their foreign policy involvement in this area. And also, another goal is, and it's often linked to the previous goal, is to prevent the persecution of Christians in these areas. And finally, in those mostly in the Christian Zionist trend within the Christian right, is to fulfill the prophecies, the second coming of God, and the Battle of Armageddon in the Valley of Megiddo, and all these goals that, and this one is mainly linked to their policy towards Israel. And in terms of means, apart from the fact that it's evangelicals are considered to be more or less 1/3 of the American electorate, but they're very mobilized, so they often go to vote, and not only in presidential elections, but also on local level, so they're really involved in that. So their vote is really important, and all candidates try to get their support. Also, they are very, very organized in terms of public opinion campaigns. Whenever there is an issue, for example, whenever there is some kind of pressure on Israel, they would buy full-length advertisements in newspapers promoting, a counter-narrative supporting Israel. And but also, if in Senate, for example, there is some kind of legislation or a vote against Israel or any other issue they think it's important, they would mobilize like really fast, either by sending emails, phone calls, or face-to-face lobbying in order to pressure a certain legislation. And then you have the lobbying and pressure groups like the National Association of Evangelicals, which is really strong and has direct access to American presidents and senators, etc. And also legislation, but one of the most important aspects of the foreign policy outreach, again, one that is not that much known outside the circles of foreign policy making, is their very strong involvement in faith-based organizations and their role in USAID programs in the Middle East and other regions. And so now I will talk a bit about the two main issues that dominate the foreign policy concerns of the Christian right in the United States. And the first one is religious freedom and the persecution of Christians. This is often an interrelated subject. And one of the most interesting aspects is that the issue of the persecution of Christians in the Middle East dates back to the mid-90s and to an article that was published in Wall Street Journal called The New Intolerance Between the Cross and the Crescent. And the interesting part of that is that it was written by a Jewish neoconservative, Michael Horowitz, who then partnered with a Catholic, Nina Shea, who was involved in the 80s, in the whole mobilization against the liberation theology in Latin America, but also under Reagan, the empire of evil about the Soviet Union and how the Soviet Union persecutes Christians and all that. So it was actually a Catholic and a Jewish who started the whole discussion in the United States about the persecution of Christians. And later on, it was kind of hijacked by the evangelicals, by the National Association of Evangelicals, and already, and I thought it was the time, or was it? Okay, sorry, yeah. And so it was hijacked by James Dobson, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and other evangelicals. And they used the civil war and the persecution and the massacre of the Christians in South Sudan as a cause celebrant in order to promote this agenda, which was then evolved into the Religious Freedom Act that was voted in 1998, which evolved later on in the Commission on International Religious Freedom, which publishes every year a report on religious freedom and has been ever since a really important tool in order to pressure countries that are presented as persecuting Christians. And it's also important to note that in this report, rarely one can see references to the persecutions of other religious minorities apart from Christians. So it's not a really important question. And then, of course, the war against terrorism and the US intervention in Afghanistan and mostly Iraq were the events, let's say, that opened the gates and allowed the evangelicals to devise and implement a strategy and get involved in foreign policy in the Middle East. And this happened on the one hand by promoting to some extent this Islamophobic perspectives and framing of 9/11, and at the time Jerry Falwell would go on TV and say that Islam is the evil, and it's using Huntington's references that it's a war between civilizations. But also by legitimizing the intervention, especially in Iraq, by using just war references. And at that time, I think it was Pat Roberts, I'm not sure about that, they wrote a letter with another evangelicals to show that the war is legitimate, and there were also, I don't remember exactly who, but who went to Larry King with, and there was a show on what Christ would do in Iraq. Spoiler alert, he would invade Iraq because that's the right thing to do. And also, so this was the framing of the whole US policy. But it's important to note that democracy promotion for evangelicals is mainly linked to what I said earlier, to open the field for missionary groups, to open the field for proselytizing within these countries, in the sense that under democratic regimes, there would be more access to these areas, and so they would be much more easier to proselytize. And in this regard, these Christian faith-based organizations were really important in order to promote these ideas. And also, there were some missionary groups. There are some estimates that in 1 year after the invasion in 2004, there were already 30 missionary groups in Iraq. And I'm talking about missionary groups, not faith-based organizations that were supposedly humanitarian, but underneath they were actually missionary. And it's a trend that was continued until now. And for example, a few years already, okay, a few years back when I and Zakia were in Iraq, most of the Christian communities and other communities mentioned how the evangelicals had access and they were taking advantage of the people over there in order to proselytize them. And another interesting aspect that has been not that much covered is the influence that the evangelicals had within the US military forces, within the Pentagon. And for example, more than half of the chaplains within the US forces are evangelicals. And the case of Jerry Boykin is really indicative in the sense that he spent most of his time preaching about how God told him what to do, and he was recounting his experiences in Somalia and how that he had taking pictures from Mogadishu, and there were some black spots, and that was the devil, and all that. So you can imagine how this might affect things on the ground. I'm not going to talk about ISIS because Elias will talk about that in more detail, but I will talk very briefly about Israel because I'm already exceeded my time. It's important to note that there are two main trends in terms of Christian rights in Israel. The first one claims that alliance with Israel is based on common liberal values. The other trend is that it's based on the Christian Zionist ideas, and very briefly the idea that the second coming of Christ will happen when first the state of Israel will be created. That happened in 48, and all Jews will go back to Israel, and then it will set forth a course of events that will end with the coming of Christ. But the Christian Zionist influence on US foreign policy was also, and that is always often overlooked, is also the product of the fact that in Israel, the religious Zionism rose more or less at the same time. So this has created an unholy, but at the same time, natural alliance between the two. And that's, for example, why when Netanyahu in 1998 went to Washington, he first went to the National Association of Evangelicals, and then Jerry Falwell said, here I present you Ronald Reagan of Israel. And that's how each is perceiving themselves. And the influence on Israeli, on US policy on Israel, and I conclude with that, has been mostly, and I think more vividly, demonstrated in the decision of the Trump administration to relocate the US embassy to Jerusalem. And if we look at what happened the day of the inauguration and who talked and who made the main speeches during that day, we see that they were really prominent evangelical, either pastors or people from the evangelical movement. And again, the way that they framed this decision was in this light of Christian Zionism and all that. And I will conclude with that. And